This photograph was taken in December 1906. It shows a city of 2,000 people, a bank, a newspaper, a telegraph office, 2 hotels, multiple saloons, streets laid out in a proper grid, buildings going up so fast the sound of hammers never stopped, men in suits shaking hands over copper deals worth millions, families moving into new homes believing they had found their future. This next photograph was taken in December 1907, exactly 1 year later. Same location. It shows sand, sagebrush, and silence. Not a single person, not one building occupied. The desert had swallowed everything. This is Greenwater, California, and what happened here was not an accident. They called it the greatest copper deposit on Earth. Newspapers across the country printed stories about the massive ore bodies discovered in Death Valley's Black Mountains. Our geologists examined samples and declared this could be bigger than Butte, Montana, bigger than Bisbee, Arizona. Copper was the gold of the industrial age. America needed it for electrical wire, for telephone lines, for the machinery driving the modern world. And Greenwater supposedly had enough copper to supply the entire nation for decades. The first prospectors arrived in late 1904, but the real rush did not start until 1906, when promotion companies began spreading the word. They took out full-page advertisements in San Francisco and Los Angeles newspapers. They printed brochures with exaggerated claims about ore quality and quantity. They sent salesmen to mining conventions to drum up investment. They promised wealth beyond imagination to anyone smart enough to get in early. And people believed them. Thousands of people. They came from cities and farms, from successful businesses and failed ventures, from comfortable lives and desperate poverty. They came because they wanted to believe that this time, this place, this opportunity was real. That fortunes could still be made in the American West if you were brave enough and quick enough to seize them. The town appeared almost overnight. In early 1906, there was nothing but empty desert. By summer, there were over 2,000 residents. By fall, Greenwater had everything a proper city needed. The Greenwater Miner newspaper published weekly, reporting on new claims, new businesses, new arrivals. The Greenwater Times Death Valley Chuck Waller started printing shortly after, because apparently one newspaper was not enough for a town that believed it was destined for greatness. A bank opened its doors, and ready to handle the money that would flow from all that copper. The Greenwater Hotel advertised comfortable rooms and fine dining. Smaller establishments offered cheaper lodging for workers and prospectors. Saloons did tremendous business serving men who worked hard during the day and drank hard at night. Merchants sold supplies at inflated prices because when everyone believes they are about to be rich, nobody argues about cost. Real estate speculators divided the desert into lots and sold them to people who had never seen the place. Mining companies issued stock certificates to investors back east who trusted the promotional materials and the expert opinions. Money poured into Greenwater from every direction, billions in today's dollars being bet on copper that supposedly lay beneath the sand. But there was a problem that some people knew about from the beginning, but chose to ignore or hide. The copper ore at Greenwater was low grade, very low grade. So low that extracting it profitably would require massive infrastructure, huge amounts of water, and transportation networks that did not exist and would cost fortunes to build. The great copper deposit was real, but it was worthless under the economic and technological conditions of 1906. Some of the early promoters knew this. They did not care. They were not trying to mine copper. They were trying to mine investors. The scheme worked like this. Promoters would stake claims on copper-bearing land, form a mining company, and issue stock. They would hire geologists willing to write favorable reports, often based on selective sampling or outright lies. They would print elaborate stock certificates with impressive names like the Greenwater Copper Mines and Smelter Company or the Furnace Creek Copper Company. Then they would sell shares to the public. The stock sold fast, too fast. People who knew nothing about mining bought shares because everyone else was buying. Investors who should have known better got caught up in the fever. Newspapers that accepted advertising money from the mining companies published glowing articles about Greenwater's prospects. It became a feedback loop where hype created more hype, and anyone questioning the boom was dismissed as a pessimist who did not understand opportunity. Some promoters made millions. They sold their shares at inflated prices to later investors, pocketed the money, and moved on before anyone realized the copper could not be profitably extracted. This was not illegal, not exactly. The copper was real. The companies were real. The fraud was in the exaggeration, in the selective disclosure, in the promises implied but never quite stated directly. Charles M. Schwab, one of America's most prominent industrialists, got involved in Greenwater. His name alone brought credibility and attracted serious money. Whether he genuinely believed in the deposit or was just another speculator looking to profit from the mania remains debated. But his involvement convinced thousands that Greenwater was legitimate. If Charles Schwab was investing, it must be real. The town kept growing even as knowledgeable mining engineers quietly shook their heads. Water was scarce, brought in by wagon at enormous cost, and fuel for smelting was non-existent locally and would need to be imported. The nearest railroad was miles away across brutal desert. Every economic analysis showed that processing Greenwater's low-grade copper ore would cost more than the copper was worth. But economic analysis did not matter when the stock was rising. People were making money on paper. Fortunes were being created in ledgers and stock certificates. Who cared if the actual mining operation made sense when you could buy shares for $5 and sell them for $15 2 weeks later? The game was not mining copper. The game was mining each other. Life in Greenwater during those boom months had a manic quality. Everyone was hustling, everyone had an angle, everyone believed they were smarter than the next guy. Claim jumpers fought over boundaries, and saloon owners watered their whiskey. Merchants sold supplies on credit to prospectors who would pay back when their claims hit it big. Prostitutes worked out of tents, charging premium prices because supply and demand applied to everything in a boom town. The heat was unbearable. Summer temperatures in the Black Mountains could reach 120 degrees. Water cost more than beer. Dust covered everything. Rattlesnakes were common. Living conditions were harsh, even by frontier standards. But none of that mattered because everyone was getting rich, or thought they were. A few voices tried to warn people. Legitimate mining engineers published reports explaining why Greenwater would never be profitable. Conservative investors stayed away, but the warnings were drowned out by the promotional machine and by human psychology that wants desperately to believe in get-rich-quick schemes. By late 1906, Greenwater's population peaked around 2,000, possibly more. The town sprawled across the desert in a disorganized mix of substantial buildings and temporary shacks. Some people invested in real construction, believing Greenwater had a future. Others knew better and lived in tents, ready to move on when the bubble burst. And everyone was waiting for the big strike. The discovery that would prove the skeptics wrong. The ore body so rich it would justify all the investment and all the hype. They kept drilling, kept digging, kept hoping. But what they found was always the same. Low-grade copper ore, lots of it. Worthless unless copper prices soared or extraction costs dropped dramatically. Neither was going to happen. The first investors to realize the truth quietly sold their holdings and left. They did not announce their departure. They just vanished, taking their profits before the crowd figured out the game was over. At its peak, Greenwater looked like a real city. Walk down the main street and you would see the 2-story Greenwater Hotel with its dining room serving meals on actual china plates. You would pass the bank where men in suits conducted transactions worth thousands of dollars. You would hear the printing press at the newspaper office churning out the latest edition. You would smell bread baking, horses sweating, whiskey flowing, and humanity packed too close together in a place that was never meant to hold this many people. The social structure was the same as any frontier town. At the top were the mine owners and major investors, men who stayed at the hotel and ate in the restaurant. Below them were the merchants and businessmen who serviced the town. Then came the miners and laborers who did the actual work. At the bottom were the desperate and the criminal, people scraping by however they could. Women were scarce, as they were in all boom towns. The ones who came were either wives of respectable men trying to make legitimate lives, or prostitutes serving the overwhelming male population. There was little middle ground. A woman could be protected by marriage and respectability, or she could sell herself and accept the risks and profits that came with that choice. The town had no patience for nuance. Children grew up in Greenwater, though not many, and families with kids were the minority. Most residents were single men or married men who had left their families behind while they sought fortune. The few children present played in streets that would be empty within months, attended a school that would close before the academic year ended, and absorbed lessons about human nature that no textbook could teach. Entertainment was limited and expensive. The saloons stayed packed every night. Gambling was constant, cards and dice passing money between men who believed their luck was about to change. Fights broke out regularly, usually over stakes or women or perceived insults. The town had no real law enforcement, just informal justice administered by whoever had the most guns or the most friends. Saturday nights were legendary for their chaos. Payday meant full saloons, fully armed men, and fully inflated egos colliding in predictable ways. Men who had worked all week in brutal heat with nothing to show for it except wages would blow everything on alcohol, gambling, and women, then wake up Sunday morning broke and hungover, ready to do it all again. The newspaper offices competed to print the most optimistic news. Every new claim was the one that would prove Greenwater viable. Every stock offering was the opportunity of a lifetime. Every visiting investor was a sign of confidence in the town's future. They printed what people wanted to read, what would keep the boom going, what would prevent anyone from looking too closely at the underlying reality. Mail came irregularly, carried by stagecoach over terrible roads. Letters from home took weeks to arrive. News from the outside world was outdated by the time it reached Greenwater. The town existed in a bubble of isolation and self-deception, cut off from the broader economy that was about to deliver terrible news. Photographs from this period show people posing proudly in front of buildings, men in suits standing outside the bank, groups of miners with their tools, the hotel staff lined up for a portrait, everyone looking confident, successful, like they had made it, like they had chosen correctly, like Greenwater was permanent. But if you look closely at those photographs, you can see hints of the truth. The buildings are wood frame construction, quick and cheap. The streets are dirt, easily reclaimed by desert wind. Nothing is built to last because somewhere in their hearts, everyone knew this was temporary. They just did not know how temporary. By early 1907, some businesses were struggling. The initial rush of investment money was slowing. New arrivals were fewer. Some claims were being abandoned as reality set in about ore quality. But the true believers insisted this was just a temporary lull. The big discovery was coming. The outside capital would arrive. Everything would work out. They were wrong. Something was happening far away, something that would kill Greenwater and dozens of towns like it. On Wall Street, in the offices of banks and investment houses, in the complex machinery of American finance, a crisis was building. And when it hit, every marginal venture, every speculative boom, every town built on hope and exaggeration would collapse. The panic was coming. Greenwater just did not know it yet. The first sign of trouble was subtle. Stock prices for Greenwater mining companies stopped rising. They plateaued. Then they started drifting downward. Not crashing, just slowly losing value as investors began questioning whether the promised returns would ever materialize. Mining engineers started publishing reports that could not be ignored. The ore was too low grade. Water costs were prohibitive. Transportation expenses made profit impossible at current copper prices. These were not opinions. These were mathematical certainties. Extract a ton of ore, process it, ship the copper, add up the costs. The numbers did not work. They had never worked. Some of the major investors quietly began selling their holdings. They did not make announcements. They did not warn anyone. They just liquidated positions and moved their money elsewhere. When Charles Schwab's companies reduced their Greenwater operations, it sent a signal that the smart money recognized. The boom was ending. By mid-1907, businesses in Greenwater were struggling. The saloons had fewer customers. The hotel had empty rooms. Merchants had inventory they could not sell sitting in warehouses. Credit was tightening as lenders realized that mines, which had not produced copper in a year, probably never would. The optimistic articles in the newspapers became desperate, pleading with readers to keep faith, to keep investing, to not give up on Greenwater's future. Then in October 1907, the panic hit. It started in New York when several banks and trust companies failed after making bad investments and risky loans. The failure spread. Stock prices collapsed. Credit dried up completely. And investors who had money tied up in speculative ventures like Greenwater mining stocks found those shares suddenly worthless. Nobody was buying. Nobody had cash to invest. The entire financial system seized up. The panic destroyed Greenwater overnight. Not physically, not yet, but economically, psychologically. The money stopped flowing. The new investors stopped coming. The companies still operating shut down because they could not get funding for payroll or supplies. Within weeks, hundreds of people left Greenwater, heading to cities where at least there might be work. Any work, something to keep their families fed through the crisis. The exodus accelerated through November and December 1907. Every day brought more departures. Families packed wagons with whatever possessions they could carry and joined the stream of refugees leaving Death Valley. Single men just walked away, abandoning their belongings because in a collapsing town, possessions had no value. Better to travel light and fast. Business owners faced horrible choices. Stay and hope the panic passed quickly, burning through remaining capital while waiting for recovery. Or close up, take whatever losses, and leave before things got worse. Most chose to leave. The bank closed its doors. The newspapers published final editions announcing their suspension. The hotel locked its rooms and put up a for sale sign that would never attract a buyer. By January 1908, Greenwater's population had dropped to a few hundred. By spring, it was dozens. By summer, it was essentially zero. The few people remaining were scavengers pulling valuable materials from abandoned buildings or die-hard optimists who still believed the boom would return. It would not. The desert began reclaiming the town immediately. Sand buried streets. Wind tore apart poorly constructed buildings. Without people to maintain structures, everything deteriorated fast. Windows broke, roofs collapsed, walls fell down. What had looked like a permanent city in 1906 was reverting to wasteland by 1908. Greenwater had existed as a functioning town for barely 18 months. From first major settlement to final abandonment, the entire life cycle was less than 2 years. Thousands of people had invested fortunes, built homes, started businesses, raised families, all in a place that was never viable, that was doomed from the start by economics and geography that should have been obvious to anyone who looked carefully. But people do not look carefully when they are caught up in fever. They see what they want to see. They believe what they want to believe. They convince themselves that this time is different, that the rules do not apply, that they will be the ones who get rich while others lose. Greenwater proved they were wrong, and Greenwater was not unique. It was not even unusual. Across the desert southwest, other towns were experiencing the same boom and bust cycle, some faster than Greenwater, some slower, but the pattern was identical. Promise, hype, rush, peak, panic, collapse, abandonment. Over and over. The desert was littered with the corpses of towns that thought they would last forever. Just down the road, the two more towns were dying their own deaths. Skidoo, California sat about 40 miles from Greenwater. Gold, not copper. Discovered in 1906, the same year Greenwater boomed. Same pattern, same promises, same fever. Within months, Skidoo had a population approaching 700. A newspaper called the Skidoo News, a bank, multiple saloons, and all the infrastructure of a permanent settlement built by people who believed they had found their fortune. Skidoo had one advantage over Greenwater. It actually had decent ore. The gold was real and could be profitably extracted. For a while, the mines produced. The stamp mill crushed ore. Gold bars were shipped out. Money flowed. Skidoo looked like it might actually make it, might be one of the towns that survived the brutal economics of desert mining. But Skidoo had the same problem as every boom town. It attracted too many people too fast. People who were not miners, not prospectors, but speculators and businessmen and hangers on hoping to skim profit from other people's labor. The population grew beyond what the mines could support. Expectations exceeded reality. And when the 1907 panic hit, Skidoo lost access to the eastern capital it needed for expansion and development. By 1908, Skidoo was in decline. The best ore had been extracted. What remained required more investment to reach, investment that was not available in the post-panic economy. People left. Businesses closed. By 1917, Skidoo was essentially abandoned. A 10-year lifespan. Better than Greenwater, but still a ghost town. Still a monument to boom and bust. Still a place where people's dreams went to die in the desert. Rhyolite, Nevada was even more dramatic. Founded in 1904 after a prospector discovered high-grade gold ore near Death Valley, Rhyolite exploded into existence. By 1907, it had an estimated 10,000 residents. Think about that number. 10,000 people living in a place that had been empty desert just 3 years earlier. Rhyolite built like it believed in forever. 3-story buildings with electric lights, a stock exchange, a board of trade, multiple newspapers, concrete sidewalks, an opera house, a school for 250 students, churches, hospitals, everything a real city needed. Rhyolite was not some collection of tents and shacks. Rhyolite was substantial, permanent. Or so everyone thought. The mines around Rhyolite produced millions in gold in the early years. This was not a fraud like Greenwater. The wealth was real. The problem was that it was finite, and everyone knew it was finite. But they acted like it would last forever anyway. They kept building, kept expanding, kept selling lots and shares and businesses as if the gold would never run out. The 1907 panic hit Rhyolite at exactly the wrong moment. The town had been planning major expansions, new mining equipment ordered, railroad extensions being built, development projects that required outside investment. When that investment evaporated, the expansion stopped. Worse, companies that had been marginal went under immediately. Unemployment spiked. People who had been getting by on construction work or servicing the boom suddenly had nothing. The decline was fast and brutal. By 1908, Rhyolite's population had dropped to about 5,000. By 1910, it was under 1,000. By 1911, most of the substantial buildings stood empty. The opera house that had hosted performances just years earlier echoed with nothing but wind. The school closed, the newspapers shut down, the banks were looted by the last residents taking whatever they could carry. What makes Rhyolite haunting is what remains. Unlike Greenwater, where wooden buildings disintegrated quickly, Rhyolite's concrete structures still stand. The shells of banks and stores and the train depot are still there, slowly crumbling but recognizable. You can walk through Rhyolite today and see the ambition frozen in ruins. See how seriously people took this place. See how much they invested in a future that never came. Both Skidoo and Rhyolite followed the same arc as Greenwater, just with slightly different timelines. Discovery, rush, peak, panic, collapse. The 1907 financial crisis was the trigger. But the underlying cause was the same. Towns built on extraction economies, dependent on continuous growth, designed to consume resources until those resources ran out, then die. But not every boom town died quickly. Some held on longer. Some fought the desert for decades, postponing the inevitable, refusing to accept that their time was over. Some became something between a living town and a dead one, lingering in a state that was almost worse than quick abandonment. Body, California was one of those towns, and what happened there shows that sometimes a slow death is more horrifying than a quick one. Body was discovered in 1859, making it one of the older mining towns in California. It grew slowly at first, then exploded in the late 1870s when major ore bodies were discovered. At its peak around 1880, Bodie had about 10,000 residents. It was rough, violent, legendary for murders and mayhem. They called it the most lawless town in the West, which was saying something in an era when lawlessness was common. But Bodie had something most boom towns lacked: staying power. The ore bodies were substantial enough to support real mining operations for decades. The town built accordingly. Not the hasty construction of Greenwater, but solid buildings meant to last. Brick and stone, multi-story structures, infrastructure designed for permanence. Through the 1880s and 1890s, Bodie persisted even as ore production declined. The population dropped from its peak, but the town remained inhabited. Families lived there, children went to school there. It was a real community, not just a collection of transients waiting for the next strike. That made what happened later even more tragic. The 1907 panic hit Bodie, but the town weathered it better than Greenwater or Rhyolite or Skidoo. The mines kept operating, though at reduced capacity. Some people left, but not everyone. Bodie entered a long, slow decline that would stretch across decades, a gradual bleeding out rather than a quick death. By 1915, Bodie's population had dropped to a few hundred. The main mines were still operational, but barely profitable. Most of the businesses had closed. Whole streets stood empty. But people remained. Some could not afford to leave. Some refused to abandon homes they had built and lives they had invested years creating. Some still hoped the next big strike was coming, that Bodie would boom again. The town entered a strange twilight existence, not quite alive, not quite dead. Buildings that had housed thriving businesses stood empty, on doors swinging open, windows broken. Homes where families had raised children were abandoned, furniture left behind because it was not worth the cost of moving. The living walked past the ruins every day, surrounded by evidence of decline they could not stop. Fires swept through Bodie periodically, destroying sections of the town that had somehow survived. A major fire in 1932 consumed much of the business district. The buildings burned because there were not enough people left to fight the fires effectively, and because nobody cared enough to invest in fire prevention for a dying town. What makes Bodie's story disturbing is how long it took. Greenwater died in a year, Rhyolite in less than 10, but Bodie suffered for 50 years. Generations of people watched their town die slowly, unable or unwilling to leave, clinging to memories of what it had been, hoping impossibly that prosperity would return. The people who stayed became increasingly isolated. Winters in Bodie were brutal, with heavy snow cutting the town off from the outside world for months. Supplies had to be stockpiled. Medical emergencies were death sentences. Children grew up seeing nothing but decline, learning that the past was glorious and the present was decay and the future held nothing. By the 1940s, Bodie had only a few dozen residents. The mines had closed for good. There was no economic reason for anyone to stay. But some did anyway. Old miners who had spent their entire lives there. Families with nowhere else to go. People who would rather die in Bodie than admit defeat by leaving. The state of California intervened in 1962, declaring Bodie a state historic park. This preserved the town, or what remained of it, in a state of arrested decay. Buildings are maintained just enough to prevent total collapse, but not restored. The idea is to preserve Bodie in a condition of authentic ruin, showing what happens when boom towns die. You can visit Bodie today. Walk the empty streets. Look into windows of abandoned homes where furniture still sits in place. See the church that no longer holds services. Visit the school where no children have studied in decades. It is haunting in a way that completely vanished towns are not. Greenwater disappeared. Body lingers. And what you find inside those abandoned buildings is disturbing. Personal possessions left behind. Photographs on walls. Clothes in closets. Toys that children played with. These people did not plan to leave permanently. They thought they would be coming back. Or they left so suddenly, so desperately, that they could not take everything. Or they just gave up and walked away from lives that had become unbearable. The lesson of Bodie is that quick death might be merciful. Greenwater died fast and was forgotten. Bodie suffered for half a century, and that suffering is frozen in place for tourists to gawk at. But there were other towns, other deaths, each one a variation on the same theme of boom, peak, and inevitable collapse. Ruby, Arizona took the pattern and stretched it across decades. Lead and zinc, not gold or copper. Discovered in the 1870s, Ruby did not become a major town until the 1920s and 1930s, when mining technology improved and metal prices rose enough to make the operation profitable. At its peak, Ruby had over 1,000 residents, a school, as a post office, a jail, a general store, and all the infrastructure of a permanent mining community. Ruby felt different from the 1900s boom towns. It came later, in an era when people should have learned the lessons of Greenwater and rhyolite. When the dangers of building towns on extraction economies should have been obvious, but people never learn. Each generation thinks they are smarter than the last. Each boom town believes it will be different this time. The mines around Ruby produced steadily through the 1930s. Then came World War II. Suddenly lead and zinc were strategic materials. Demand skyrocketed. Prices soared. Ruby boomed like it was 1906 all over again. More miners hired. Families moved in. New buildings went up. The town expanded beyond what the peacetime economy could possibly sustain. But everyone knew, or should have known, that war production was temporary. When the war ended, demand would crash, prices would fall, mines that were profitable at wartime prices would become money losers at peacetime prices. This was predictable, inevitable, and yet people kept building, kept investing, kept acting like Ruby would last forever. The war ended in 1945. By 1946, Ruby was in trouble. Demand for lead and zinc plummeted. Prices crashed. The mines that had been running multiple shifts cut back to skeleton crews. Within months, the major mining company announced it was closing operations. Not temporarily, permanently. The ore was exhausted, or at least exhausted at prices that could sustain extraction. The shutdown was brutal and fast. When the mines closed, there was no reason for anyone to stay in Ruby. No other industry. No agriculture. No alternative economy. The town existed solely to support the mines. When the mines died, the town died. People left so quickly it was like everyone got the same message on the same day. Which, in a sense, they did. The mine closure announcement was a death sentence for Ruby. Within weeks, hundreds of people packed up and left. Families who had lived there for years abandoned homes they had built or improved. Business owners walked away from stores full of inventory. The school closed mid-year as families with children fled. By 1947, Ruby was essentially abandoned. A handful of people remained, caretakers and holdouts, and those with nowhere else to go. But the town as a functioning community was dead. Gone in less than a year from fully operational to ghost town. All the infrastructure that had been built to last was now useless. All the investment in permanent structures was worthless. What happened to Ruby happened to dozens of mining towns across the West in the years after World War II. The war had created temporary demand that propped up marginal operations. When that demand evaporated, towns that had been holding on by their fingernails finally let go. The post-war years saw a wave of mining town deaths that rivaled the 1907 to 1910 period for devastation. Ruby remains today as another preserved ghost town, maintained by private owners who charge admission for tours. You can walk through the old buildings, see where people lived and worked and raised families. See how quickly they left, how much they abandoned. Understand how a community of over 1,000 people can vanish in months when the economic foundation collapses. The Ruby graveyard is particularly haunting. Graves of children who died in the 1930s and 1940s, buried in a place their parents thought was permanent, a place the families intended to stay for generations. Those children are still there, in a cemetery that nobody tends anymore except as historical curiosity. Their parents fled, but the dead remained. Every one of these towns, Greenwater, Skidoo, Rhyolite, Body, Ruby, followed the same pattern with minor variations: discovery, rush, peak, decline, death. The timelines differed, the specific causes varied, but the fundamental story was identical. These were places built on extraction, designed to consume resources until those resources ran out, then collapse. And the people who lived in these towns were not stupid. They were not naive. They understood, at some level, that mining towns do not last forever. But they convinced themselves that their town would be the exception, that their mine would keep producing, that new discoveries would extend the boom, that somehow, impossibly, the laws of economics would not apply to them. They were wrong. They were always wrong. Every single time. Look at the pattern. Really look at it. 5 towns spanning 70 years across 3 states, different minerals, different timelines, different specific causes of death, but the same story repeating over and over with only minor variations. This was not coincidence. This was structure. This was the inevitable result of how America approached resource extraction in the West. The first common thread was speed. Every one of these towns grew faster than any sustainable economy could support. Our Greenwater went from 0 to 2,000 in months. Rhyolite hit 10,000 in 3 years. Ruby boomed during the war and died when it ended. The speed was intoxicating, exciting, and deadly, because anything that grows that fast is built on unsustainable foundations. The second thread was speculation. In every case, the real money was not made mining ore. The real money was made selling shares, selling lots, selling the dream to people who arrived too late to get in on the actual value. The promoters who made fortunes in Greenwater never expected the mines to produce. They expected to sell shares to suckers and get out before the collapse. Mining was theater. The real business was fraud. The third thread was isolation. All of these towns were remote, difficult to reach, far from reliable water and supplies and transportation. This isolation made everything harder and more expensive. It meant that when the boom ended, there was no fallback economy. A mining town in the middle of a desert has no reason to exist when the mines close. There is nothing else to sustain it. The fourth thread was environmental destruction. The mining operations devastated the landscapes around these towns. They polluted water sources. They stripped timber. They left toxic waste that poisoned the land for generations. Even when the towns died and people left, the environmental damage remained. Visit these sites today, and you will still find contamination from operations that closed a century ago. The fifth thread was denial. Everyone involved, from the miners to the investors to the merchants to the families, knew on some level that this was temporary. But they acted like it was permanent because acknowledging the truth would mean accepting that everything they were building was doomed. So they built churches for congregations that would not exist in 10 years. They started cemeteries for the dead of a town that would be abandoned. They opened schools for children who would have to finish their education somewhere else. The 1907 financial panic deserves special attention because it killed so many towns simultaneously. That panic was triggered by speculation and over-leveraging in New York banking, but it destroyed communities across the entire West. When Eastern investment dried up, mining towns that depended on that capital collapsed. The people living in these towns had no say in the banking decisions that killed their communities. They were just victims of a system they did not control. But calling them victims is only partly accurate, because many of these people were also perpetrators. The speculators who drove up stock prices in Greenwater defrauded later investors. The promoters who exaggerated ore quality profited while others lost everything. The merchants who charged inflated prices exploited miners who had no alternatives. The cycle of boom and bust enriched some and destroyed others, often the same people playing both roles at different times. What drove this pattern was the fundamental American belief that resources are infinite and growth is eternal. The idea that you can extract wealth from the earth forever without consequence, that you can build economies on consumption rather than sustainability. That boom and bust is acceptable as long as some people get rich in the process. These ghost towns are monuments to that belief system. They are also monuments to human resilience and stupidity in equal measure. The resilience of people who built lives in brutal conditions, who persisted through hardship, who created communities in the middle of nowhere, and the stupidity of doing all that in places that were obviously doomed, that could never sustain populations long-term, that existed only to be consumed and discarded. The really disturbing part is that we never stopped doing this. We just got better at hiding the inevitable collapse. Modern resource towns still follow the same pattern. Oil towns boom and bust. Manufacturing towns rise and fall when factories close. The mechanism is the same. Build an economy around extraction or production of a single commodity. Grow too fast. Ignore sustainability. Collapse when the resource runs out or the market changes. Call it creative destruction and move on to the next place. The ghost towns are warnings we choose not to heed. They show us what happens when we build communities on unstable foundations, when we prioritize short-term profit over long-term sustainability, when we let speculation and greed drive development. And we look at them, take photographs, call them historic sites, and then go build the same kind of towns somewhere else. Because we never learn. We cannot learn. Learning would require admitting that the American model of resource extraction and economic growth is fundamentally unsustainable. That building towns and lives on the assumption of infinite growth inevitably leads to collapse. That the way we do things is doomed to repeat the cycle of boom and bust forever. So we build. We boom. We collapse. We leave ruins. And then we do it again somewhere else. The only difference between Greenwater and modern extraction towns is time. The pattern never changes. Walk through Bodie or Rhyolite today and you see something disturbing. Not just the ruins, but what the ruins contain. Personal items left behind. Furniture in abandoned homes, dishes on tables, children's toys on floors. These are not the possessions of people who planned to leave. These are the belongings of people who fled. What does it mean when you abandon your furniture? It means moving it costs more than it is worth. It means you are broke, desperate, and unable to afford transport. Or it means you left so fast that taking furniture was not possible, that you grabbed what you could carry and ran before things got worse. Either way, it speaks to desperation that we rarely discuss when we talk about the Old West. The schools are particularly haunting. Visit the schoolhouse in Bodie, and you can still see desks, chalkboards, books. Lessons were being taught here. Children were learning to read, to do mathematics, to believe they had futures in this town. Then one day the school closed, and those children were pulled from their education and taken to somewhere else, somewhere their parents hoped would be more stable, would not collapse like Bodie was collapsing. What happened to those children? How did growing up in a dying town affect them? What did they learn about promises and permanence, and whether adults could be trusted when they said a place was safe and secure? These are not rhetorical questions. Real people experienced this trauma. Real children watched their worlds literally crumble around them. The cemeteries reveal even darker truths. Families buried children in these towns, put them in the ground believing that this was the family's permanent home, that future generations would tend these graves. Then the town died and the living left, and the dead remained. Many graves in these ghost town cemeteries have no maintenance, no visitors, no one who remembers the names carved on weathered wooden markers. There is something particularly cruel about burying your child in a place you later abandon. It suggests either that you did not want to leave but had no choice, or that you chose survival of the living over honor to the dead. Either option is tragic. Either option shows the brutal calculus people had to make when boom towns collapsed. The mines themselves are monuments to wasted labor. Thousands of hours spent digging holes in the earth, extracting ore, processing it, shipping it. For what? For brief enrichment of a few investors and owners, for paychecks that barely covered survival, for communities that existed for a few years and then vanished. All that effort, all that human energy expended, and what remains is just holes in the ground and toxic waste. Think about the opportunity cost. The labor that built Greenwater could have built something permanent somewhere else. The capital invested in rhyolite could have funded sustainable development. The human potential that was squandered in Ruby could have created lasting value. Instead, all of it was consumed in extraction economies designed to burn bright and die fast. But we cannot simply blame greed or stupidity. The people who lived in these towns were often doing what seemed rational at the time. Mining jobs paid better than farming in most cases. Merchants made more profit in boom towns than in stable communities. Investors saw returns that would have been impossible in established markets. The system rewarded the behavior that ultimately created the collapses. This is what makes the ghost towns so unsettling. They were not mistakes made by foolish people. They were the logical outcome of a system working exactly as designed, a system that prioritizes extraction over sustainability, short-term profit over long-term stability, or individual enrichment over community welfare. These towns died because the system that created them was designed to produce boom and bust, not stable prosperity. The ruins also show us how quickly nature reclaims human spaces when we abandon them. Greenwater was gone in years. Even the substantial concrete buildings of rhyolite are slowly crumbling. Give it another century and they will be piles of rubble. Give it 1,000 years and there will be no evidence these towns ever existed except maybe archaeological traces that future scientists might puzzle over. We build these grand projects, invest enormous resources, create these monuments to human ambition and ingenuity. And nature shrugs and erases them in the blink of an eye, geologically speaking. The desert does not care about our towns, our economies, our dreams. Oh, it just waits for us to leave so it can take back what we briefly borrowed. What the ghost towns reveal most clearly is human capacity for self-deception. Everyone involved knew on some level that these places were temporary. But they constructed elaborate fictions to avoid facing that truth. They built churches because permanent towns have churches. They started newspapers because permanent towns need news. They brought their families because permanent towns are places where you raise children. The fiction of permanence was necessary to make the temporary bearable. But the fiction failed. The towns died. The people scattered. And what remains are the ruins, silent testimonies to everything we build and everything we lose and everything we refuse to learn from history. Greenwater lasted 1 year, Skidoo lasted 10, and Rhyolite made it 7. Body suffered for 50 before finally dying. Ruby vanished in months when the war ended. Different timelines, same ending. Every single one abandoned. Every single one left to the desert. These ghost towns are not historical curiosities. They are warnings. They show us what happens when we build economies on extraction rather than sustainability, when we prioritize growth over stability, when we let speculation and greed drive development, when we refuse to plan beyond the next boom cycle. The ruins tell us that we have been making the same mistakes for over a century and show no signs of stopping. The American West is littered with these corpses, hundreds of ghost towns in various states of decay. Some preserved as tourist attractions, some left to rot in isolation, all of them monuments to the same pattern of boom, peak, collapse, abandonment. All of them warnings we continue to ignore, because we are still doing it. Right now, somewhere, a town is booming based on oil or fracking or some new commodity. People are moving there believing it will last forever. Investors are pouring money and chasing short-term returns. Businesses are opening, schools are being built. And in 20 years, maybe 50, that town will be another ghost, another ruin, another warning that the next generation will also ignore. The cycle continues because the system that creates it continues. As long as we treat land and resources as things to be consumed for profit rather than managed for sustainability, we will keep creating boom towns. As long as we allow speculation to drive development, we will keep building communities on unstable foundations. As long as we prioritize individual enrichment over collective stability, we will keep abandoning places and people when the profits dry up. Greenwater was not unique. Greenwater was typical. That is what makes it horrifying. The town that died in a year was following the same playbook as dozens of others before it and hundreds of others after it. The specific details changed, but the fundamental pattern remained constant. Discover resource, promote wildly, build quickly, extract rapidly, collapse inevitably, abandon completely. What would it take to break this cycle? Actual long-term planning. Diversified economies not dependent on single resources, investment in sustainability rather than extraction, policies that prioritize community stability over investor returns. None of which is likely to happen because all of it conflicts with the fundamental American belief that growth is always good, and bigger is always better, and the market will solve everything. So the ghost towns remain. Testaments to everything we built and everything we destroyed, to the dreams we pursued and the realities we ignored, to the futures we promised and the ruins we left behind. They stand in the desert, waiting for us to learn something, anything, from their example. We will not learn. We never do. We will visit them, take photographs, marvel at the ambition and folly of previous generations, and then go back to our own lives and repeat the same patterns in new locations. Because confronting what these ruins really mean would require confronting the entire economic and social system that created them. And we are not ready for that confrontation. Greenwater was built in 1906. By 1907, it was gone. That should have been the end of the story, the final warning that stopped us from ever making the same mistake again. Instead, it became just one more chapter in an ongoing saga of boom and bust that shows no signs of ending. The town is gone. The pattern persists. The desert waits patiently to reclaim the next one. And somewhere out there, someone is staking a claim, printing stock certificates, promising fortunes to investors, believing that this time will be different. This time the boom will last. This time they have learned from past mistakes. They are wrong. They are always wrong. But they will build anyway, and the desert will wait, and history will repeat. Again. If this investigation into America's most spectacular failures opened your eyes to patterns we keep repeating, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Tomorrow we are exposing the truth about Tombstone, the town that was supposed to be permanent but nearly died 3 times before finally admitting it was just another ghost town waiting to happen. The Old West is full of stories about places we built and abandoned, and we are uncovering every one of them. See you in the next investigation.